Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center. On behalf of the China Environment Forum and Environmental Change Security Program, I want to welcome you here on this nice, chilly DC morning. And my name is Jennifer Turner. I have some new faces because ECSP, they sent out the invite as well, and I always love that, get to know new people, and I'm going to lure you into my mafia. I've been directing the China Environment Forum here for 13 years, and I consider 13 very lucky. I love my job here at the Wilson Center. We are, as many of you know, some verbatim, who come here all the time, that the Wilson Center was created in 1968 by Congress as a memorial to our 28th president. And in his spirit, we bring the policy and scholarly worlds together to look at foreign policy issues. And as I mentioned, I say lucky a lot. You know, it's that Chinese thing of me. I'm very lucky. And he was the only president with a PhD. I can't mention that every time because I could... He was our only PhD president. Helen will always toss that in there for us. You threw me off, Helen. So we've been, at the China Environment Forum, we've been bringing government, NGO, business, and researchers together around the world to look at energy and environmental challenges in China. And those of you who are regular visitors here at the China Environment Forum, and you're part of our mafia, you know that we've been digging quite deeply into the water-energy confrontation in China. A lot of that we've done multimedia reports. We have 3 new ones out just this last week. We've got shale gas report just came out yesterday, looking at China's shale gas and the water question. But we also, one of our multimedia reports that we did with Circle Blue, also, we talked a little bit about dams. Today we're going to talk a lot about dams, the domino dam effect. But we're not just looking at China, because river basins, they're kind of sneaky things. They don't just stay in one country a lot of times, right, guys? Nope. And so we're going to talk today about the Mekong, and I've got, I call them my Mekong rock stars here today. I've got Ed Grumbine. Yeah, you are a rock star to me, Rich. He's currently on a 3-year fellowship as a senior international scientist at the Kunming Institute of Botany, which is under the Chinese Academy of Sciences in Yunnan Province. Can we all just take a moment to glare at Ed? Because he's living in, I used to live in Kunming. He's living in Kunming, the city of eternal spring, and you would not be freezing your tush off if you were in Kunming.
It never goes below freezing.
Yeah, never. So
on the other hand, no central heating.
Yes, that's true too. But I lived in Changsha for a year, which was Chicago weather. Try that with no heating, honey. That's that's another challenge. When he's not like lounging out in the sunshine, he does a lot of projects. They're focusing on defining environmental security on China's western borders, water governance, and hydropower development in the Mekong River Basin and the Himalaya. And he also kind of like wanders off and does stuff in India as well. I don't think he sleeps, has been my impression in his conversations. And another man who I also don't think sleeps too often, but appears to also put sentences together quite well, is Rich Cronin. He's the director of the Southeast Asia program at the Stimson Center. So he's a local guy, so he's used to freezing. He works on transboundary and non-traditional security issues in the Mekong Basin and Southeast Asia. And he's got a couple, you talk about one of the most recent books, The Mekong Tipping Point, Hydropower Dams, a must-read.
Turning Point is the most recent, actually.
And then Turning Point, and you didn't have that in the bio.
Point, may have to go back to Tipping Point.
So turning, tipping, playing with those gerunds there over at the Stimson Center. But yeah, so I think he's between optimism. I love shameless advertisement. This is good. So enough of the talking. We got the people who got caught on Metro to come in more. So these guys are going to regale you with maybe a little bit of rampant anecdotalism, facts, shocking things. Starting upriver, macro with Ed. Again, upriver's China, China's in control, so Ed, you're in control. And you guys, your job is to sip your coffee, eat your sweets, and get ready some difficult questions for these guys when you're done. You ready? Yeah, I like response. Make sure you're awake out there.
Ed will be a hard act to follow, even without the fact that he looks more like a rock star than I do. Huh?
Okay, Ed.
Zhashang, good morning. It's great to be here. Rich and I have coordinated our presentations. I'll be covering kind of a macro view, setting up Rich to go into some Mekong details as a case study. I'll be focusing a lot on work in progress, which allows you to ask me a lot of difficult questions that I will have a difficult time responding to. And then I can just say, well, we'll get to that when the work is complete. So this is a moving target presentation, and let's call it Transboundary Environmental Security in the Mekong River Basin. But as a macro contextual guy this morning, I'm going to move much farther afield than just the Mekong. Consider the macro view zooming in from the Asian highlands, the Water Tower, the Himalayan Qinghai Plateau, through China and down into the Mekong, which Rich will guide you through. So this is work in progress, and at the macro view, Bangkok looks a little different than when you're on the ground. Of course, this is only a portion of Bangkok. I'd like to begin by sharing with you 4 or 5 key general framework ideas that inform the current work and this presentation. First of all, most of global growth, that would be population growth, GDP growth, and new energy demand growth, is going to be coming from the developing world as opposed to OECD countries, the so-called developed world. One thing you want to note about this first key point is that the timeline on the slide is 2010 out through the next 2.5 decades. The important message here is that we're just beginning a global growth roller coaster ride. It's not going to happen from developed world demand, and the Asian portion of this growth is about 1/2 to 2/3 of what you see in these percentages at the global level. In my neck of the woods, the Greater Himalaya, the Asian highlands, of which the eastern edge is in Yunnan, we have 9 major river basins pouring off the plateau down across the face and in and around either the western or eastern side of the Himalayan massif. Those river basins support the water needs of a significant percentage of all the people living on the planet. So growth is taking off. We're not in the middle, we're at the beginning. The second key message, having more to do with our specific topic today, is that transboundary problems require transboundary solutions. There is no getting around that, but humans, being who we are, attempt to do it all the time. There are 6 arrows on the slide. You might say each one representing one of the 6 Mekong Basin nation states. Very few of those states at any deep level of political commitment are in communication around managing any of the transboundary resources that we'll be discussing today. Those transboundary resources could be water-based, as in rivers flowing across sovereign state borders, or they could be atmospheric-based, as in air pollution or carbon emissions. The third key point I'd like to emphasize is that transboundary problems have both technical and political components in regard to their solutions. We tend to focus on the technical part of problem solving because we perceive it as easier. For example, this bar graph here is all the major rivers of the world and the graph represents their sediment load. The bars at the bottom are the world's highest sediment load rivers, and 6 of the 7 bars at the bottom are in Asia and come off the Qinghai Tibetan Plateau. The river at the bottom, the Brahmaputra, is the most sediment-rich river in the world. So scientists looking at linked social ecological problems like transboundary river management like to play around with data because it helps them publish papers, and whether it gains them political influence or not is another story. And it doesn't really make any difference from the technical part of problem solution, where the sediment comes from. It could come from land use practices. It could come from poor infrastructure development, planning, and implementation. That's the Mekong in the background. However the sediment gets into the rivers, the result are brown sediment-laden waters. Unless you build dams to stop the flow of that sediment and it gathers in the reservoirs behind the superstructure of the dam. And here in this picture you can see the water is relatively clear. The sediment is settling out above the dam and is filtered out by the dam, so the downstream water is also clear. This, as Rich will get into, has significant implications for the Mekong. And transboundary problems also have their political components. For example, leaders of sovereign states with transboundary issues might define things like what is the issue around sediment in different ways. Is sediment important? To one leader it might be more, to another leader it might be less important. Or even something more general, environmental security. How would that be defined by China versus the US versus Laos versus Vietnam? Each nation state will have a different take on the definition of security. Another key framing message would be that in transboundary problems, as in most all problems, people and nature, or the social and the ecological components of problem definition and solution, are linked together. In American academies, in Chinese universities, experts are taught to be discipline focused. That won't get you very far in regards to transboundary environmental solutions. For example, almost nobody would think that what is going on in urban development in Southeast Asia, whether it's China as you see here, or Thailand or Vietnam, would have much to do with nature. But the cement that builds the cities in China comes from some place. It's not an urban phenomenon in terms of its origin. So if you go inside out from urban areas out into nature, you'll see links. And if you go from the outside in, this clear cut inside a protected area in Laos exists for a reason. The local people who may have cut these trees are not doing it for local use. They're selling them on a global market. And these wood products will often end up in a city. Ecologists who look at the countryside or urban planners who just focus on urban issues will miss at least one half of the problem solution toolbox. And of course, the links between what happens in the countryside, here you see a peasant woman in northwest Yunnan working in her field, are obviously tied into global issues like globalization and its impact on local income levels. Right now in China, the difference between the same work in a city and the work in the Chinese countryside is about 3.13 to 1. So villagers are continuing to move to urban areas in China and all over the region in question today because they can get paid over 3 times as much for the same kind of work. So you could look at this, this flow chart and you could focus on the box on the left. That would be where the climate scientists would hang out. Or you could look at the box on the right, and that would be where the environmental policy makers and experts would hang out. But forget about the details in any of those boxes. What I'd like you to take a look at are the arrows that connect those boxes. That's the kind of problem solving following the arrows between the boxes, linking problem sets together that will help us gear up to dealing with rivers that go across nation-state borders. And Jennifer here at the Wilson Center, in cahoots with the Circle of Blue, have given us role model pathways to explore the links between different systems. Thank you, Jennifer.
Thank you for reading.
So one of the things you can find out on the table here, and I'll describe very briefly here, both in terms of praise and critique, is how people are beginning to hook up different problem areas, in this case the food, water, energy, so-called nexus. Nexus is a good word to use. You might look it up in the dictionary. It means links between connected areas. So we're linking together impacts of water, food, and energy on each other. And so in terms of China for the next 10 years or so, the water required to render coal into usable energy for heat is going to go up as a percentage of all the water that's used in China from 23 to 28%. At the same time, over the same timeline, water used to produce food in China in the agricultural sector is going to go down a fair amount. The question is there enough water in China to service both expanding energy and expanding food needs? The answer is not clear, but the work that Jennifer has pioneered here is helping us get a better handle on how to address these questions. Choke points. So let's talk about what is missing from this food, water, energy nexus work so far. If you look at energy, the work here and Circle of Blue is focused on coal, but coal is not the only energy sector in China that uses water. Nuclear energy requires tremendous amounts of water. Hydropower obviously requires a lot of water. No one has linked all the different water-using energy sectors together yet in a macro analysis. Also, we've talked a lot so far in our analytical surveys about quantity of water, but no one has much addressed the water quality, which is a serious issue in China. In terms of coal, what kind of power plant is using that coal factors into how much water is needed in the production of that energy. That's not in the analysis yet. And of course, the timeline of analysis 2010 to 2020, what happens after 2020? What's the post-2020 view? Between now and 2035, China is projected to grow its energy use by the sum of all current energy use in US and Japan today. What's missing from the food, water, energy nexus in regard to food? Water use efficiency. Well, maybe you have less water, but you use it more efficiently. In China, you have less water and low efficiency. China has one of the lowest efficient uses of water in any sector, in any country in the world. That's the bad news. The good news is there's room for improvement. Then you take a look at arable lands. You can, in a paper published just last year, China is supposed to have 135 million hectares of arable land. A paper that was published just a few months ago says there's about 121.7 million acres. The red line in China that the government has sworn not to go below is 121. My analysis is that there's probably about 111. They've already gone well below it. So data from China is sketchy often, and that needs to be factored into analysis. Then, of course, there's the meat consumption aspects of the use of water to produce food, which is skyrocketing in China. And, of course, irrigation as a part of Chinese agriculture is very low efficient. So factoring all these things in together will alter our picture of the food, water, energy nexus. And, of course, there are other choke points beside food, water, and energy. Let's take a look at what some of these other choke points might be. Population in China and in the Mekong Basin. The first number is 120 million people. That's the number of new people that will be added to the Chinese population up to 2025 from UN data. The number of people moving to Chinese cities, however, during that same time will be 300 million plus. In the Mekong Basin, over the same timeline, we have about 70 million people living in the Mekong Basin right now. Population growth is dramatically higher in the Mekong Basin than it is in China. They're going to add another 50% to their current population in the next 10 or 15 years. About 17 million of those people will be in cities. Another driver here, another choke point, would be land use. China is known for its planting more forest than any other country in the world. But what's a forest? How Chinese defines forest would not pass muster with any forest ecologist.
But they're so nice in rows.
Indeed. Then you look at forest loss. In China, as well as all the other Mekong Basin countries, natural forest is being lost at a relatively high rate. From country to country, the rate changes. Then you have the concept of empty forest. So you have a lot of forest, you have a canopy, but there are no animals in the forest. Do animals have an uninteresting role to play in forest ecosystem dynamics? The answer is no. And then you have ecosystem services that might be provided by forests. Right now, according to the best Chinese data, only about 11% of all the forests in China have their full suite of ecological services functioning today. Let's look at a particular example from the upstream in the Mekong Basin. This is the southernmost part of Yunnan province, the Xishuangbanna prefecture. 1992 on the left, current data on the right. The brown represents the spread of rubber plantation monoculture. It's now about 23% of the entire prefecture. This is a Landsat satellite photo from 2006. So the white is rubber plantation. The black line throughout the middle of the slide is the border between Laos and Yunnan. Up on the left, in 2006, when this photo was taken, there were about 16,000 hectares of rubber plantation in Luang Nam Ta, the northernmost province of Laos, right next to Yunnan. Now, it's about 31,000. It's almost doubled in 6 years. So it's not just happening in China. There is no data from Myanmar, where it's probably worse than in southern Yunnan or Laos. These forests have virtually no ecological value. This would be a natural forest, and this would be a plantation forest, although this is not rubber, this is camellia, this is tea plantation, which is also going in at record rates to service a cash economy. There are benefits to monoculture, rubber or tea, but the costs are substantial. Then we can take a look at hydropower as another choke point. This is the Shaowan Dam in Yunnan, the third tallest dam in the world, under construction, now operating. And this is a map of the Mekong Basin from the upwaters in Yunnan down through the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. The key thing to look at this map are the colors of the circles. Blacks are already operating hydropower dams. The white circles are proposed, planned, not constructed yet dams. Over 100 in the basin. Rich will get into some details on this.
No, but that's a great map. I want to say that.
Okay, how many people in the room want to steal that map? Raise your hand right.
You don't have to steal it. You can download it off a paper that was published in February this year if you need the citation. It's a paper I authored with a Chinese and Australian colleague, and I just stole it out of the paper. This is the site of the Shayaburi Dam, which is projected to be the first lower Mekong across the mainstream dam, and will begin, or depending on how you look at it, continue the domino effect of hydropower in the Mekong. Dams in the Mekong, dams in China, critical issues. But dams are not just happening in Southeast Asia. Let's take a look at what's going on globally. In terms of China's support of hydropower development worldwide, at least 300 dams are being built or supported or financed by Chinese companies right now somewhere in the world. If you break that down into Southeast Asia, about a third of those dams are in Southeast Asia. But it's not just Southeast Asia. In a paper that was just published a couple weeks ago, I worked with an Indian co-author on looking at hydropower development in the Indian Himalaya. And there are almost as many dams in the Indian Himalaya than China is supporting worldwide. And outside of India, still in the Asian highlands, there are 128 major dams either being built or planned to be built in the next near term. Context to understand what's going on in the Mekong.
Just one clarifying with in the Indian Himalaya, those are financed by
For whoever.
whoever.
Not just China.
It's not just China.
Yeah.
Just want to make sure.
Yeah, just the first two numbers
First
are
two
Chinese
China. That's what I was
finance.
double checking.
Yeah. Moving away from ecological components in socio-ecological systems, let's take a look at the social drivers that might turn into choke points. And one key framework tip to follow here is that it's not just about population or food. You have to get down into the fine-grained data, as we will do, to look more carefully at what population means, or in this slide, what food security means. What it means in the Mekong Basin is that over 2 million people are going to lose their primary source of protein and livelihoods if wild-caught fisheries in the Mekong are impacted by hydropower development. These fish are special, not just because they're species that in many cases live nowhere else, no other river system in the world, but they are also migratory. About 75% of all the fish in the Mekong migrate significant distances as part of their life cycle. Dams interrupt migratory pathways. Fish cannot live unless the migratory pathways are maintained. Food security. Moving on to things that are not often connected to environmental security would be how many migrant workers are living today in China. Let's do some basic math. There's at least 250 million people who have left the countryside for work in urban areas in China. The number at the top represents the number of school kids that those urban migrant workers have living with them in China cities, about a little over 18 million. Actually, I just saw a number yesterday that puts it over 20 million. The number of children that are left behind by those migrant workers is factored into around 60 million kids who are living with relatives, grandparents. Then you add in the 250 million adults who are living in cities, and you do some basic math, some addition, and you get about 326 million Chinese, or about 25% of the population of China, who are second-class citizens because they have their hukou permits do not allow them the social benefits, education, renting apartments, social safety net services, all are dramatically lacking for about a quarter of all Chinese people. This is not a prescription for social stability. Last but not least, as a social driver, is the new old nation that is ramping up in China, that percent of the Chinese population that is 60 years or older. China has arguably the fastest aging population in the world. Right now, there are about 187 million people in China who are 60 years or older, and that will ramp up to, by 2020, just a few years, to about 300 million. The social safety net around elder care in China is basically non-existent. Let's use a baseball analogy. For you Nat fans out there, go Nats, go Nats. If you go to a Nats game and you equate the beer selling services for 50,000 people in the stadium, say, with the ratio of trained healthcare workers for elder people in China, that would be on a given game day in Washington, you'd have about 25 people in the stadium selling beer to 50,000 people, or about 2,000 to 1. If you do a little back of the envelope, the current Chinese policy to take care of elder folks is that the government will take care of 10% of those people and families the other 90%, leaving aside whether families can do that. If you take 10% of 187 million, let's call it 20 million people, if you support each elder person at the poverty level, 6 RMB a day, which is about 2,200 RMB a year, I didn't do the math, but I invite you to do it and see what percentage of China's GDP would go towards supporting 20 million elder people today at the poverty level. Whoever has the answer gets a free cup of coffee. The last driver to look at would be climate change. And you see the Tibetan Plateau in the center of the slide, reminding you that all the rivers in Asia, which all Asian people depend upon for their water needs, food, energy, what have you, originate on the plateau. One common problem I see with lay folks who are trying to grapple with climate change is that the number 2 degrees, that's our global standard that we're trying to keep below. But 2 degrees is a global average. It has nothing to do with what will happen in the Mekong, where temperature projections show that actually it will be below 2 degrees centigrade by 2080. That's our timeline for this slide. But on the plateau itself will actually exceed 2 degrees and go up to 3 degrees. Why is that important? Because the water resources on the Mekong are going to get fried. Not the Mekong, but all the rivers coming off the plateau. So it's going to be worse on the Tibetan Plateau water tower than most other places in the world. Temperature has already risen almost 2 degrees on the plateau. Temperature and precipitation changes as a result of carbon emissions have ecosystem impacts. From 2011 data from China, looking at ecosystems on the plateau, what you're seeing is grasslands disappearing, being reduced by about 1/3, and shrublands increasing by about 1/3. So people who depend on, and how many millions of Tibetan grazers are there on the plateau? Local people who depend on pastoralism for their main livelihood are basically going to get rubbed out by ecological changes due to carbon emissions. All this data, incidentally, is out of date. If you look at emissions themselves, this is probably the most important slide for our future in my presentation. China passed the US and isn't looking back in terms of being the world's #1 carbon emitter in 2007. Look at the numbers. We've stayed roughly the same, and China since 2007 has considerably increased its emissions. They will more than double by 2020, and that is not when carbon emissions are going to peak in China. The question is, when would they peak? You can't develop coal to the degree that China plans to develop coal and have your carbon emissions peak without a technological fix that does not exist today. In the US, you see hurricanes, huge storms, causing governors to make statements like this. This is a now statement. Sea level rise, focusing down on Southeast Asia and then taking a look at the Mekong Delta. The color on this slide, the darker reds are where sea level rise impacts on coastlands are the highest. And you can see the east coast of China, Tianjin, Shanghai, Guangzhou, are right in the crosshairs. And the Mekong Delta is even more so. So based on 2007 data, which is hopelessly inaccurate today, the delta is going to decrease because of sea encroachment on the land by anywhere from, best case scenario, 20%. And in 2010, Vietnam's GDP, about 25% of all of it came from the delta, primarily in the form of rice agriculture. This data is hopelessly out of date. So what we're doing, when you look at linked social ecological drivers of change in China, in Southeast Asia, in the Asian highlands, in the Mekong Basin, You're looking at taking stable riverine ecosystems, this is the Lancang Mekong, that have been stable for roughly hundreds of thousands of years as river systems yielding important ecological services, and you're destabilizing them. At the minimum, you're making them less resilient to upcoming social and ecological changes. Less resilience looks like an upturned umbrella. You're going to get wet. There are many policy models to deal with increasing levels of uncertainty. In the center of this slide, you take a look at data collected neutrally and presented transparently, and then you build scenarios based on what that data tells you, and then you make your political choices toward solving problems. We don't do this very well, we being everybody, whether you're in the US, China, or the Mekong. So this is quotes that are just a few months old from Chinese white paper on energy, a great document if you want to see the projections out for the next 10, 20 years. China did not, does not, and will not pose any threat to the world's energy security. Maybe, abiding by the principles of equality, reciprocity, and mutual benefit, China will further strengthen its cooperation with virtually all other countries in the world because somebody is consuming and producing energy. So Rich may disabuse us of whether this statement is accurate or not.
Not at all. It's very accurate. No, I'm sorry. It's the point you were making was rather reverse of what they're saying, and it's very inaccurate.
Yes. I'm certainly not against China. I have many positive things to share later on, especially during question and answer. But this is political rhetoric that is divorced of hydropower development reality in the Mekong Basin. China has unilaterally developed the only mainstream dams across the Mekong. It has not used the principles of reciprocity, equality, or mutual benefit in the construction of those dams. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And as we switch slides, I just want to note, thank you so much, because in some ways the outline you gave there, with our choke point work, and I didn't mention in the beginning that we've done these multimedia stories with Circle of Blue. We have Choke Point China Part 2 is still coming out. I've sent the lads off to India. We're doing Choke Point India. We call it global domination. But I'm in the process of forming a China water energy team, also known as WET, right? Going to have 4 U.S. and yes, you say they'll make T-shirts. No, they'll sorry, they will. But this group of U.S. and Chinese scientists, policy, and legal experts that I want them to kind of this path that you laid out. We've been doing some of the stories, but to look at choke points more deeply, and to help set the research and. They help set the research and policy kind of potential roadmap for China, because there's definitely, the data issue, we all know this who do China, but you're right, a lot of the data is old, but there is data there. Because one thing we found with our choke point work, if you show up, people do give you data, right? Okay, shall we flip your slides on?
Yeah, you want to flip
I will
them?
do that
Thank
for
you. Okay, well, thank you. While Jennifer's flipping to my presentation.
And you're tipping and turning.
No, I was going to say Ed's presentation. Well, first of all, the pictures were perfectly, chosen to make the points you made, and I was very impressed by that. But talking about China and your choke points, and I was reminded of when I was growing up. There was used to be these comedy records. You buy a 33.5 third. And there was this guy, New England guy, who did this record called Bert and I. And he would tell these tall Maine stories, And so this one story is about tourists who stopped by a guy's house asking how to get to Kennebunkport. And so the punchline, though, is he goes, yeah, you go here, you go there, et cetera. But the punchline is, come to think about it, you can't get there from higher. And when I look at China's problems, I don't know how you get there. And looking at it from the perspective of the lower Mekong countries, or even the ASEAN countries, you see China in the Mekong, upper Mekong. You see China in the South China Sea. In both cases, non-reciprocal, very pushy, if not aggressive. And you look at these countries, and for instance, Laos, 9 million people, something like that. You know, a big country, land-wise, and rich in resources, but they're going fast, and most of them are going north, particularly the timber, minerals, etc. So, with that start, let me say just a quick word about Stimson. We're a nonprofit, non-partisan, and non-government, and we depend mainly on foundation grants and, in some cases, some contracting work, including for our and other governments. And my Mekong work actually has been supported primarily by the MacArthur Foundation, for which I'm very grateful, as well as McKnight Foundation and the Critical Ecosystems Partnership Fund. And also want to introduce Zach. Please stand up or wave your hand. This is my colleague, Zach Dubell.
Zach.
And Zach had a lot of input into this presentation as well. And Zach and I just got back from 2.5 weeks in basically Hanoi, Ho Chi Minh City, Saigon, and Bangkok, talking to people about these issues. And they're very much on everyone's mind. And just one other thing about China. Ed mentioned how many dams China's building around the world. There's just been a disaster in Cambodia on the Stang Atay Dam in the Cardamom Mountains of Cambodia, where the first big project that the Chinese have done by a company called China Datong has one of the turbine houses or tunnels into the turbine blew out, and the dam was already 60% full of water. All the water came out in a huge rush. Fortunately, the losses seem relatively small so far. That is 3 or 4 or 5 workers disappeared, and possibly some Chinese supervisors. But it was a catastrophic collapse of that section of the dam. And I want to point out that if you look at this map now of dams on the mainstream, which I'm going to be talking about.
Wait, need a mic because we're in webland.
Okay.
I don't know how loud you can shout there.
Okay. Thanks. This one of the dams at it's Pak Beng, I think, isn't it? Yeah, Pak Beng Dam, which will be the next dam that Laos wants to build after Sayaburi, is also a China Datong project, and the Sayaburi is a Thai project. So this could be a setback for China for a while. We'll see, at least in the region. They have the worst record in the world for dam collapses and whatnot. Okay, so Ed's done a great job of the big picture and a lot of very relevant detail. And I'm going to just dig down a little deeper with regard to these Mekong issues. And so you've already seen Ed discussed the Chinese dams in Yunnan, starting from Mengsong up. And China's that cascade of dams that they're building, including 2 of the biggest dams among the biggest dams in the world, will actually have theoretical capacity to hold more than 30 billion cubic meters of water, and that's enough to in theory, that's enough to regulate the river. It's somewhere between as much as a half of the total flow from China every season, every year. And then downstream, you have two clusters of dams in the northern Laos and down in northern Laos, you've got 6 dams, and the Sayaburi Dam is the first one that the Lao are now proceeding to build. I should say they're not building it. The Thai's building it. Thai Construction Company, the Electrical Generating Authority of Thailand, 4 Thai banks, and the engineering work. And then down in the sort of middle reaches of the river, there are 2 dams, the Bon Kum and Latsua. Those are on the Thai Lao stretch of the river. So the upper dams are all within Laos. But these are 2 on the Thai Lao border and a shared border. And they're questionable about whether they'll ever be built because the civil society in Thailand is going to give the government and the developers a hard time trying to build any dam that's anchored on the Thai shore. And then in the south, you've got another 5 dams. Well, actually 6. One doesn't show here. It's not so important because it's really a diversion rather than a mainstream, rather than a dam across the whole river. Particularly the Don Sahong Dam, Song Trang, and Sambor are some of the worst dams on the river, and probably the worst dams on the river, in part because Don Sahong is at Cone Falls, and it would block one of 18 channels, channel out of 18 that fish in particularly dry weather can migrate northward for spawning. That's the one they want to put a dam on, of course. And then Stung Treng is a huge dam right at the confluence of the so-called 3S river systems. And then Sambor would be 35 kilometers wide because the land is relatively flat there. And the reservoir from Sambor would go something like 150 kilometers north, all the way up to practically to the base of Stung Treng. And that would be a catastrophic dam because the lower down the river you get, the richer the fisheries are, and the more they're dependent on not only deep holes during the dry season for survival and for upstream migration for spawning. And of course you have the Great Lake of Cambodia there, so Tonle Sap, which is also a very important part of the ecology of the river. And that lake is in the dry season it's only a few meters deep, and in the wet season the lake and the river that connects it to the mainstream expand like 4 times to the size of Lake Superior. That's a pretty big seasonal wetland. And then, of course, finally at the end you have the Mekong Delta, and Ed mentioned some figures on the contribution of the Delta to Vietnam's GDP. Those figures, may be somewhat questionable, as you indicate, but essentially the Delta produces almost half of Vietnam's rice crop, much of which is exported. So it's not only food but export earnings as well. It's a site of extensive aquaculture, and there are 17 million people there live there who then still depend primarily on fishing and agriculture. And then one other thing about dependence on the river. Ed, you mentioned 2.1 million people's livelihoods are at stake. I think that's maybe, if you're looking at the organized sector of society, yeah. But in terms of the population of the lower Mekong, particularly the lowlands areas of Cambodia and Vietnam, you're talking as many as tens of millions of people. Let's put that, tens of millions of people who depend wholly or primarily on fishing and agriculture, and in terms of, for instance, protein in Cambodia, something like 60–80% of people's animal protein comes from fisheries. And there are more than 2 million people alone who just live around the edges of the Tonle Sap Great Lakes. So it's a really big issue. I'm going to run through. So I hadn't expected to see this sequential opening of the slide. Okay. Anyway, so I've already mentioned, you got the upper Mekong, and you have China's Cascade, two of the world's largest dams. There are no dams in Myanmar. Myanmar only contributes about 2% of the flow of the Mekong. Most of the Myanmar's rainwater goes eastward towards Irrawaddy and other major rivers. And then I've already mentioned these dams. Oops, what happened? Yeah. All right. Now, I know what I have to do. This one. Okay. I mentioned that. This sediment issue is really important, and Ed has also referred to that. The Mekong Delta is already sinking, as you know, and suffering serious intrusion of seawater. And the Delta depends on silt during the flood season to rebuild itself every year. And it also depends not only on silt, but on nutrient-rich silt. And the lightest silt and the most nutrient-rich sediment comes from Tibet and Yunnan. And I think at some point Ed mentioned, maybe something I read, the steeper the slopes, the more silt is captured. But it's the lightest silt that actually makes it all the way down to the Mekong River, Mekong Delta. So when this silt is captured in Yunnan, then you showed the picture of the cleaner water in the dam and the reservoir. Then the water comes out of the reservoir, and it wants to. It's got less siltation than went in, less turbidity, if you will, and so there's this concept called hungry water. If you have a glass of water here, and I started pouring salt into it, or even sugar, it would disappear, and then suddenly it would you'd see some on the bottom that didn't get absorbed. So the water becomes fully saturated. The water naturally wants to become fully saturated. So it leaves one dam, it starts picking up more silt. But each time it does this, as it moves down the river through a series of dams, the silt particles get heavier and heavier, bigger and bigger. And so what happens is that that silt that's scoured from the riverbeds and banks is not as nutrient rich, and it's heavier, so that we're going to see eventually, if you think about the map I had up there, where right around Cone Falls and below, above Phnom Penh, the river gets tidal, and it runs very flat. And so the silt is going to start piling up before it gets to, not only before it gets to the delta, before it gets to the lowlands of Cambodia, sort of piling up and spreading out. And that will be a huge, huge threat to the delta. And by 2050, projections of what the delta looks like Swiss cheese. And that's a very, very serious situation. Ed mentioned not only technical issues, but political. So we have a problem here that China is not a member of the only regional water cooperation entity, which is the Mekong River Commission. Still consists of Cambodia, Laos, Thailand, and Vietnam. China is not a member. China is so-called an observer. But up until recently, China would not even supply data on flood stages during the monsoon. They've now agreed to provide data, I think, on a weekly or daily basis, even on flood stages, but they still don't provide any data on what's happening during the dry season. So the river's been through more than 10 years of drought, and each year it seems to get worse, and the Chinese will never provide information on whether they're filling or spilling their dams. And so they've built this huge storage capacity in Yunnan, and they have to fill those dams to make them do what they want them to do, which is to produce power year-round and also to support navigation in the lower Mekong. So the idea is you capture the water in the flood season, and then you release extra water during the dry season, up to 40% of the usual, more than usual dry season flow. It's not happened. China's the biggest dam, Shaowan Dam, is complete. It's operating. It's been filling for more than 3 years, and each dry season, each January, February in particular, the boats are still stranded. People downstream are saying, "Where's the water?" You know, it just gets, and so it gets back to this. There's this joke I mentioned earlier. This punchline, you can't get there from here. I mean, there's a real question of whether there's enough water to make this cascade of dams work the way that China intends, and I mean a serious question. And Ed has talked about shrinking snowcap and reduced flows of water and silt from the Tibetan Plateau, and that's a real factor. Now, the other point is that China's dams upstream are an enabler of the lower Mekong dams. The 11 or 12 dams proposed for the lower Mekong in Laos and Lao Tai border and Cambodia, most of them would not be economically feasible without an augmentation of the water supply during the dry season. In other words, for 4 or 5 months of the year, there's not enough water in the river to support power production, and the lower Mekong dams would all be what they call run-of-river dams. They're big dams in many cases, but they don't have reservoirs big enough to store water for more than a few days or a week or so at the most. So climate change is definitely a factor, and I mean the Chinese developed this scheme probably going back to the 70s, and they started building them in the 80s, the dams in the 80s, and it was a whole different world then in terms of water availability and climate. So this picture at the top is just outside Vientiane, Laos, during the dry season, and this boat seems to always be there, but in the wet season, of course, it's floating well. But this is the dry season, and it's high and dry. And you can see the rest of the river. You could walk and swim across to Thailand without any big problem. And in the evening in Vientiane in the dry season, thousands of people are out on the dry riverbed just taking their evening stroll, enjoying the air. So I mentioned this economic viability will depend on augmented flow from China. The other point about these projects is that Thailand is still the main power purchaser. Vietnam is closing on them a bit. Vietnam and Thailand are the two biggest consumers of electrical power in the lower Mekong. And all these projects they call them public-private partnerships, but they're really all commercial projects. And essentially, developers, Thai developers, Chinese developers, a Malaysian company, they come to the Lao government in particular and say, "Hey guys, we'd like to build a dam for you, and you won't have to put any money into it, and we'll build it, and we'll operate it for 25 years, during which period we'll pay you revenues, and then we'll turn it over to you at the end." What they don't say is by that time it'll be silted up and will be useless. But at any point, these are all opportunistic projects, and so when you hear people allow government talk about they need the power for development, they need the revenues. The fact is the revenues they're getting from these projects are relatively low. The damage, and they're also scheduled. Most of the payback comes in towards the end of the life of the dam rather than up front. And then in addition, I forgot what I was going to say. Never mind. Okay, but the main point is that they are commercial projects, and so one of the potential points of pressure from, for instance, civil society opponents of the projects is that they do have to gain financing, and the financing these days, except for China's a question mark. You know, what are the criteria that Chinese banks, Overseas Development Bank and others, are using to make loans for these projects for Chinese companies? It's not clear whether they want them to be, they insist on profitability, or whether this isn't partly just to keep Chinese companies in business overseas. So that's a real issue. This is another shot of the Savoy Dam site, and of course this was during the time when the Savoy Dam was supposed to be under suspension because of opposition from Thailand even at that time, and Vietnam and Cambodia. I also mentioned there's also an issue of not just mainstream dams, but tributary dams. And there are a number of major tributaries of the Mekong that enter mainly in Cambodia, including the so-called 3S river systems, Sekong, Sason, and Srei Pak rivers, which are all being dammed mainly by Vietnam and Laos. And this is actually Vietnam's Sason 3 dam. And on the Sason River flows from Vietnam to Cambodia. And the first dam, Vietnamese dam, Yali Falls Dam, had done in the past has done lots of damage and caused loss of life downstream in Cambodia because of the irregular releases of water to meet the operating needs of the dam, and of course releases of water during floods seasons. I mean, it's people talk about these so-called multi-purpose dams, and one of the purposes is supposed to be flood control, but in fact, if the flood is too big, then the dam has to spill water to protect itself, and that can be catastrophic downstream. Myths, these big dams are needed for development. Well, this is pretty self-explanatory, but hydropower isn't clean. It's a major methane producer because of the rotting trees and vegetation that for 30 years methane's bubbling up from this stuff rotting. And then finally, this idea of it's critical to future power needs. Thailand, the main consumer, constantly overestimates its energy needs. And the killer is that all the mainstream dams, if they were all built, a consulting company that did a strategic environmental assessment of the cumulative impact of all the dams, they did it for the Mekong River Commission. They concluded that by 2030, only 6 to 8% of the output of those dams would be, which is only 6 to 8% of total electricity consumption in the lower Mekong. Now, for that, you'd kill the river. And now for that, if you look at 6 to 8%, Thailand is nowhere on energy efficiency, and you've mentioned China as well. And so easily, the Thais could save 6 to 8% or more, and much more, in fact, from energy efficiency measures. I wish I'd had Ed's a slide of one of your early slides about Bangkok all lit up at night, because in a way there's this sort of bookended situation where on the one hand you have poor people eking out an existence, a hard existence, by mainly agriculture and fisheries aimed at just subsistence, activities. And on the other hand, you have the great shopping malls and all that of Bangkok and other major cities. And so actually I was in Bangkok a couple weeks ago at a interesting film showing organized by IUCN on this issue of these dams. And one of my criticisms was, and question I raised was that this is just, here we have the happy people, the happy peasants, enjoying their lovely life of fishing and backbreaking agriculture. And on the other hand, we have these glossy urban areas that are huge consumers of electricity. And I've actually had a chance to ask a senior Lao official from the energy ministry, what about in between? You know, and he actually gave a very you know, thoughtful response, including, well, we're also working on that stuff. But the basic issue here is development model. I mean, you know, if you go to Laos, nobody's starving. Go to Cambodia, people are pretty hungry, but mainly Laos, are decently well fed and clothed. But the point is that their incomes and the Cambodian incomes and Vietnamese incomes could all be raised substantially just through, in place, through education, agricultural extension services, better management of resources, health care, and power through, you know, smaller dams or biogas or other sources. So there's this whole skewed idea of development that in the Southeast Asian countries in particular seem to think the 1930s were like, you know, the greatest period in the world for industrial development because they built all these giant dams. And they'll say to Westerners, why are you complaining? You built your dams and now you're rich. And, you know, we're saying, well, for us, we inherited an almost empty continent, save a few million Native Americans. And so we exploited those resources, and nobody was dependent on the river, Mississippi or the Tennessee River and Columbia River. Few people were dependent on them for their fish or other resources. But in the Mekong, you've got a hugely productive ecosystem that supports, you know, tens of millions of people, and they're still dependent on it. And where are you going to find the employment? They're all going to end up in the cities, right? And again, Ed talked about this issue of population growth and migration. So they can build dams faster than they can find employment for the people that are being displaced. This I'll just, it's too hard to read, but the main point here is that the Portland State University, under a contract from USAID, did a desk study of sort of who benefits and who loses from these projects. And if I could have the
Have the mic. Are you going to do your
yeah, I'm
dance,
gonna get
your
up
floor
again.
show again there?
Yeah, okay.
Okay, here we go.
Okay, just quickly.
Rock star thing.
This is under under the Mekong River Commission's Basin Development Plan. Calculations were made of these mainstream dams and their impact, and so you see Laos wins a lot, although even here, $20 billion over 20 years, $22 billion over 20 years, that's really not a lot of return. But anyway, Laos wins, Thailand wins slightly, Cambodia slightly, Vietnam slightly, and the total, is slightly. But then you've changed the assumptions. For instance, you revalue the fish to be more realistic compared to what the data the Mekong River Commission was using. If you change it, have a different discount rate for the loss of the lost resources, then you get different outcomes. And so, to make it short, if you went from what the Basin Development Plan has to this is a 10% discount rate, which almost says, hey, in 10 years these are gone. Build the dam. I mean, the resources will be gone. But if you go back to, I think 4% or 1%, assuming that the resources are not disappearing, you get very different outcomes. And so in this case, with the 1%, you get, which is an extreme assumption, but not implausible. Then you have a situation where Laos still wins, but Thailand itself loses big, $128 billion. And Cambodia loses big, $110 billion, and Vietnam loses big, $50 billion. So it all depends on assumptions, and that's the old line. You know, there's data and lies, damn lies, and data, something like that.
And you can't get there from here.
All right, so I'm going to stop shortly here, but. Again, Ed mentioned the issue of it's not just technical fixes, if there are any. It's the politics and regional relationships to promote transboundary cooperation. And so you have a problem where not only within the MRC, they have a procedure for mainstream dams called Procedures for Notification, Notification Prior Consultation Agreement. They went through that process with the Sayaburi Dam, and last April, 3 of the countries, including Thailand then, which was under a different government, said we don't accept the dam because we don't agree to the dam because we're concerned about various risks and impacts, you know, transboundary impacts. Shortly, for less than a year, the Lao were saying, this was a personal Lao prime minister to his colleagues, we are suspending the project pending further studies, but just a month ago or less, the Lao announced that they were going ahead with the Sayaburi project, and not only that, but they were going to start the Pak Beng dams shortly, and they were to build the dam at Don Sahong down at the Cone Falls. So one of our sort of contributions to this issue, conceptually anyway, is that all these dams should require you know, top-of-the-line environmental impact assessments and socioeconomic impact assessments, which certainly was not done in the case of the Sayaburi EIA was pathetic and had no transboundary element. But also that, and this is an idea that came from former Prime Minister Abhisit of Thailand, but I saw his response to some environmental groups, and I thought, well, this makes pretty sense, because he said, you know, what we should have is a standard to which all countries the countries could agree on what was acceptable, you know, impact in terms of fisheries, livelihoods, future of the Mekong Delta. And so he's gone now, unfortunately, and the Yingluck Thaksin government is happy to pour concrete over anything. You know, I picked up on that, and I said, well, okay, let's have a Mekong standard for transboundary impact. Now, it's not a standard for EIAs. The EIAs should be, you know, first class, but the standard is what can the 4 countries agree is acceptable maximum damage or transboundary impact. And so that's one of the things we're trying to promote with our project this year, is this idea of a Mekong standard. Now, admittedly, it's at least common denominator, so it's not ideal, but the idea would be to say to Laos in particular, okay, you know, surely you understand or accept the idea that you can't simply develop at the expense of other people, or you can't get revenues from exporting electricity totally expense of your neighbors. So let's agree, you know, let's negotiate on some kind of a standard for what's acceptable downstream impact or transboundary impact from these projects. Is that possible? Probably. It's a long shot, but on the other hand, what we're trying to do is get it started talking about it through Track 2 type discussions, including our so-called Track 1.5, including officials participating in their unofficial personal capacity. So a framework for transboundary cooperation. If it's not the MRC, what? There's something called the Greater Mekong Subregion. It's an ADB project that got started in 1992. How many people are aware of the GMS? Yeah. Well, basically, the ADP and the Japanese, Asian Development Bank and the Japanese and other donors are building a network of major highways across the whole Mekong region. So there's a north-south corridor that connects Kunming and onward to Beijing, if you will, Kunming to Bangkok, and onward to peninsular Malaysia and Singapore. Then there's a east-west corridor that runs from Cam Ranh Bay to Molmine on the Andaman Sea, Burma, in Myanmar, and which would be used theoretically to transport containers across, truck containers across the Mekong, rather than having cutting off 4,000 miles of a shipping route. around the Mekong Basin. And then there's a north-south corridor that runs from Kanta and Maito in the Mekong Delta through Ho Chi Minh City, onward to Phnom Penh, and then to Bangkok. So the point is, there are 6 countries in this, and China's a big player. And China gets huge benefit because it's all roads lead to Kunming and to the coast. For instance, there's a leg that goes to Hainan Port, for instance. But China will not let the water be part of that discussion. So it's all about building roads and infrastructure and even electrical transmission lines that are hooked up to any dam anyone wants to build, but there's no discussion of cooperative and sustainable water development. Finally, this idea of, well, the U.S. has gotten involved through the Lower Mekong Initiative. Briefly, it's not a whole lot of money, but it's been growing in size. It was Secretary of State Clinton's initiative. And the State Department's working hard, and now USAID, to institutionalize the LMI so that beyond into the next Obama administration. But it involves the 4 Lower Mekong countries, the 4 MRC countries, plus Myanmar. So Myanmar is negotiating it into the MRC, but they're already in the Lower Mekong Initiative. And I could talk about it more at length, but I won't right now. And then finally, I would say a more responsible Asian Development Bank and World Bank. They're not, they cannot build any of these mainstream dams because they're too environmentally and otherwise destructive. But they could be more involved in helping with more sustainable development kinds of activities in Laos in particular.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. And you can go back. Yeah, let's applaud there. Yay. All right, keep that solution one up. That one was
the solution one?
Keep the solution. We want to have glass half full, thinking we can get somewhere from here.
The last slide?
The other one, yeah, I like that one.
Okay.
It's saying some positive things.
Right.
And Thina and Tyler can maybe take the mic. So raise your hand high and proud if you have questions. That was part of your assignment. Okay. And do say when you get the mic, your name, and we have a fair amount of time, but we'll keep it moving because I like to get a lot of good questions here. We got to make these guys sing for their. I'm buying them lunch later, so sing for their supper.
Donald Barnes from Guangxi University. We've talked a lot about the dams. Of course, this is a conundrum. Are you saying that the energy is not needed, and therefore we ought to do away with the dams? Other people would say, if the energy is needed, is it better to build dams or burn coal? And how do you come down on those issues?
Well, I'll get the energy, whether the energy is needed or not, and that basically Laos needs development, and the government is seeking income above board and below board. Sorry to say, but the point is that dams are always a trade-off, and we're not saying don't ever build dams. No, they can be a better option than coal, for instance. But mainstream dams are just a bad idea from the get-go, particularly because of the way that they block fish migration, they capture silt, etc. So the problem with the mainstream dams mainly is Laos has the geography, and they have very low development prospects for any kind of industrialization or anything because of small market, small population. But the big consumer, Thailand, and secondarily perhaps Vietnam, they both have such huge scope for conservation and more energy efficiency that you don't need the mainstream dams, And even for Laos's income purposes, it's still got, scores of dams that are being built in the highlands that are less damaging than mainstream dams that are being built to export power to Thailand and to gain revenue. So it's just it's one of these things where In the narrow sense, maybe it's good business for developers. It's good business maybe for government officials. Some people will benefit from it, but in the macro, it's a bad trade-off. And so it's not. So in that sense, you know, as I say, 6 and 8% of total consumption in 2030. You'd ruin a river for that. I mean, ruin one of the world's most productive rivers, most productive after the Amazon, to get that.
And Rich, can I ask you a question too? Because my friend Darren McGee up at Hobart William Smith College, he was telling me that this question of power being exported to other countries, that even some Chinese dams, even in Yunnan, may actually kunsider exporting energy, or do you think?
Oh yeah, actually the Shawan Dam and well, the first dam, Manwan, is why Kunming is a big city right now. But the Shawan Dam, most of the power is going to Guangdong, and some cases to Shanghai also through a big grid.
So they leave the area. But one thing that when we were doing our first choke point China research, and again we dipped our toe into the dams, and we'll go back to them more deeply in this next phase, but that because the water levels were so low, we were being told that, well, that's okay, don't worry, 别担心. We put a coal-fired power plant with every dam. It's like, it's like your shampoo, 25% more free, and that confuses me because dams are part of the, you know, part of their new.
Most dams actually require some auxiliary power because of times when they can't generate electricity. And of course, the conundrum for the Mekong is that, and other places, I guess, is that the hottest weather, when you have the most demand, for instance, for air conditioning electricity, is when the water is the lowest. So that's the whole idea of the Chinese cascade, is to store enough water to keep everything working year-round. But as I pointed out, I think there's some real questions about whether they can make that actually work the way it's supposed to.
But with the auxiliary power need, I mean, that one thing that we were struck with is that there's a growing need for coal in Southeast China, where they have extremely low quality coal. It just, you know, it's just thinking, you know, more about the CO2 footprint.
Well, it's another question. It's another big factor in the viability of dams. Is just that big dams, especially, is that you still have to have backup power. And of course, the bigger the dam, the bigger the backup power has to be, right? And again, though, the Chinese, if it worked the way they wanted to, they would have enough water to keep everything running year round. But it doesn't seem to be working that way.
And as Ed told us, the glaciers are melting. All right, some other questions out here. In the back, let's look at. We'll be prejudiced to this side of the room initially, and then we'll like the left side, my left.
Hi, Ken Kozakowski, Department of State. I have a question. You mentioned it a couple times on the Zayaburi Dam. I know it's kind of the first big dam or mainstream dam. I don't want to use the word domino in this region, but
hopefully not. But yes, possibly.
So. Either right before or right after the groundbreaking happened last month, it seemed like Vietnam and Cambodia kind of walked back from their objections. I know they came back and said, oh, no, we still object. But I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that and the details of that, and then also what kind of precedents this sets going forward.
Yeah, thank you. Well, for a while it looked like the precedent set by the first use of this PNPCA process, this protocol for consultation and, you know, eventual, hopefully, acceptance of the projects, looked like it was working. So that's why this report says Mekong tipping point. This is the first one. And this one says Mekong turning point because it was after the suspension of the Zayaburi Dam. And so the question was, hey, this looks like this process might actually be working. Cautiously optimistic, not wholly so. Vietnam's in a real bind, as you know, and Zach and I and his predecessor who worked with me, you know, we've talked to the Vietnamese a lot about this, and including this last trip we made. And essentially, the problem with the Zayaburi Dam is that they started building the dam long before they ever went through the PNPCA process. So by the time they did this review, and the three lower Mekong countries said, you know, we don't accept it, the company and the banks and the EGAT, Electric Generating Authority of Thailand, had already sunk millions of dollars into this dam. So it was always iffy whether they could actually ever stop it anyway. The Vietnamese position has been and remains that they they know they can't just stiff Laos. They know they just can't say, hey, we don't want your dams. So what they're looking for and what they've been campaigning for is they want to see a cumulative impact assessment of all these proposed dams, all the dominoes, if you will, before they would say yes or no about any one dam. So they're saying, you guys are jumping the gun. We have to have this cumulative impact assessment first. And actually, the U.S. is trying to help get this started, and Japan stands ready to help. But for now, the Vietnamese had to swallow it. So I'm told, we were told that the Vietnamese ambassador to Laos actually was at the so-called ribbon cutting for the Sayaboy Dam. He didn't have anything to say, but he was there, and I think probably his Cambodian counterpart as well. So looking down the road, the Vietnamese, they're going to fight every dam, but they have a real problem because China's influence is gaining and theirs is slipping steadily. And, of course, even there's a slipperier slope because all the old comrades and all the old generals are dying and dying off. And so, Vietnam's influence isn't what it used to be. China pretty much controls northern Laos in terms of plantations and infrastructure projects, et cetera. But they're not giving up. This isn't over at all by any means. Yeah. No.
Okay, there you go. Thanks.
Hi, thank you so much for your presentations. It's such a challenging and beautiful region, so it's always interesting to learn more. From reading, when I remember there was a lawsuit from Thai civil society, and I'm not sure where that went, and that's part of the question, what happened to that? And then the other, you talk about empowering civil society. I'm from WWF, and I think that's a core element of the solutions. What is the situation of regulations in the other lower Mekong countries in terms of access to legal remedies to, in a way, to be part of those solutions?
Yeah, great question. Thank you. The lawsuit is still there, still pending. I don't know what its status is, but the point of the lawsuit is that EGAT, the Electrical Engineering Authority of Thailand, signed a power purchase agreement with the CH Karchong, the company, developer, before an EIA had been completed and accepted, and so that violated Thai law. So there's an angle there that they can try to exploit through the court system. The issue of civil society, one of the three reasons why we called this turning point was that in Vietnam anyway, there was this transformation of the rights of civil society because while Vietnam still does not allow protests against its own dams, it was quite happy to let civil society loose on the mainstream dams because they weren't Vietnamese dams, and of course on China's dams. And so, that I've been to at least half dozen meetings. In fact, I was we were part of the first meeting with Pan Nature, our in Vietnam Rivers Network in Hanoi 3 years ago, where the government allowed the first public discussion of these issues. And in the Mekong Delta, I've been to a meeting where organized by civil society, but the whole morning was taken up with local officials ranting about these mainstream dams. So that's sort of a bit of progress. But in Cambodia, Hun Sen makes all the decisions. He does seem to have a better appreciation, though, of the issue. I think he now understands, and the Cambodians are looking at it like alternatives to Sambor Dam, but it's all sort of vague now, but maybe a dam that wouldn't block the whole river, that would just, accept lower power output to draw water off the river for power. Laos, there's no scope for civil society activity of any significance. However, the capacity is growing in Laos, and I think they do have a growing understanding of these issues. And the senior official in Bangkok at this ICU and film showing, basically said in response to the question I had asked him, he said we will proceed cautiously about the other dams. Whether that's just for public consumption or that's for real, I don't know. But he seemed to. I think they're getting a growing appreciation, and partly through this PNPCA process and through the strategic environmental assessment that the former CEO of the MRC, Jeremy Bird, got started.
Good questions out there. Okay, left side of the room. Your day in the sun has come. You can toss mics. And if you could stand up so we could see you and tell us who you are.
Thank you. I'm Roman Manzienko of American University, and I appreciate very much your sharing a little bit of wisdom with us. There was a little bit of discussion regarding potentially displaced persons, and I was hoping you might be able to elaborate on some...
With what?
Potentially displaced persons.
Oh, yeah.
I was hoping you might be able to elaborate on some underrepresented stakeholders.
Ed?
I can begin to answer that. I don't know the exact numbers from the 2010 assessment of all the dams in the lower Mekong. Let's just say the number of resettled people would be significant. Do you know that number off the top of your head?
No, I mean, I think the 2.1 million figure you gave probably is pretty close to the number of maybe resettled people, maybe even less than that actually resettled. Yeah. But the issue is they're only the tip of the iceberg, the people that actually have to be resettled because of the transboundary impacts. It's, you know.
So to look at the upstream in China, the dams that have already been built have created a fair amount of controversy over lack of a following through on China's resettlement laws. The reality doesn't match the policy on paper, but the government has squelched that debate and also has improved resettlement since the original Manwan Dam in 1995. So going forward, dams on the Mekong in China that have yet to be built, nobody knows the exact number, but everybody knows there will be more than the original 8 or 9 that we're now talking about. Resettlement will be a part of those dams' development as well, but nobody knows. They're in relatively less settled areas than the cascade that now exists. Rich is correct in that resettlement is the tip of the iceberg. Probably in the lower basin, fewer than 500,000 people would be resettled, would be flooded out of their homes. Yeah. But the important human impact in the lower basin is food security. There's no way that anybody knows today of how to replace the protein needs of 80% of Cambodia's population, which depends on wild capture fisheries from the Mekong, if those fish populations are decimated. And they will be decimated if all the dams are constructed. So nobody knows how to deal with, let's call it, existential impacts. It's easy to move somebody, but it's not so easy to feed somebody. So this debate basically doesn't exist much in the societies of the lower basin countries. And without cumulative impact analysis of the cluster, the cascade of proposed dams, there's no way to attach a number on either specific resettlement or specific numbers of people who would be rendered food insecure.
But there's also kind of, we can use the water pun, the ripple effect too on biodiversity more broadly. That, I mean, how do you even begin to predict, I mean, the impacts on agriculture? Because crazy thing, water matters.
You can't. And two related points, though. One is that urbanization is already a huge problem in Southeast Asia and certainly in China, being driven by, among other things, for instance, Thailand's dammed all its rivers now. So many rural people have had to leave. But also because, as Ed mentioned, people can... Bad as things are in the countryside, often they can make more money in the urban. But one of the arguments that we try to use with governments is not just don't build the dams or think about the environment or the people. No, think about stability of your government, of your regime, because if there's too much displacement, and it's too fast, these countries are going to be destabilized. And also there's the issue of regional relations. How far bad the things have to get before relations are poisoned, if at best, at least, in these countries. And so those are big considerations too. And then finally, actually, all you need is one wrongly placed dam to decimate the migratory populations of, say, for instance, either the upper Mekong, either above Cone Falls, that population, or below Cone Falls in the lowlands. Either of those places, one dam could have a devastating effect on wild fisheries. So it would affect everybody.
Okay, remember left side gets a little more time here. Okay, left. We'll go back to righties, no worries. Yes.
Yeah, Randy Curtis from the Nature Conservancy. Thank you both for your excellent presentations. We've talked about the top-down regional strategies and top of the government and bottom-up civil society. What about the regulatory agencies for water and rivers within each country? What's being done, what could be done to strengthen their capacity, and how important do you think that is in the short term?
You want to take that first? I want to say something about Thailand, but if you want to go China
Let me set
first.
that up, and then you can hit the ball out of the park.
So, okay. I love the baseball metaphor.
Or strike out.
Back.
I'm in China there's not much of a baseball.
You got to start your own team in Kunming there.
Right. So let's take a look at that. Each country has a different story. So the story that would apply to China, to answer your question, would be different, if not dramatically different, throughout all the lower basin countries. So one size does not fit all. The capacity is highest for, let's call it, good governance in China and Thailand. Those are also the two wealthiest countries in terms of per capita income. On the other hand, Laos and Cambodia are two of the most impoverished countries in the world. And in Southeast Asia, what comes with lack of wealth is also lack of government capacity. And that shades over not too soon into corruption. So there are tremendous levels of corruption which would undermine any capacity for good governance, whether that means engagement of civil society or empowerment of local people who would be immediately impacted by dam development or what have you. But Cambodia and Laos are two of the most corrupt countries in the world, and what you see is not what you get. So when you take a look at ministries in any of these countries, you will have greater or lesser capacities, greater or lesser corruption indices, things like that. And a lack of transparency and openness of information sharing throughout for different reasons. In Laos and Cambodia, it would be a lack of capacity. In China, there's plenty of capability, but the government chooses to define the Mekong as a national security issue, so all bets are off, and the state can proceed as it pleases. So that would be a framework to begin to answer your question. Maybe Rich can fill in some details.
Well, I would say with Thailand, probably all in all, Thailand is better governed than China, at least more honestly governed. I think. I'm not too sure, but even in Thailand, and certainly civil society is much more free, and you have an open political process. But a couple years ago, I talked to senior official in the water ministry, water environment, and water part of it, and she told me that that often when they get EIAs for water projects, they'll still have the name of the other project on the paperwork. Some other project. It's just the whole thing is significantly a sham. And it's the powerful people in the political side and the business political side who often are the ones that make these decisions. And unless there's a catastrophe of some kind, then nothing nothing happens. There have been catastrophes, and the classic is the Pakmun Dam in Thailand, where civil society has eventually forced them to open the gates 4 months of the year to sort of help the fisheries a bit. But the dam was a disaster, and it started the environmental movement in Thailand. Really, was that dam? That's 2 decades ago now.
I can add a little bit more. So trying to be practical, seeking solutions. One of our blinders here is that our society is based on a rule of law. And in most of the Asian countries, all of the countries we're talking about this morning are based on rule of the boss who's in charge. And each country is slowly, unsteadily moving toward a more laws and rules-based system. So it's easy to look in from the outside and go, well, how come they're not doing that? But the answer is not the same kind of answer that we would expect here, because we're used to good governance and traffic laws that are implemented, for example. So there's also someone a moment ago mentioned the domino effect. The dominoes have already hit each other. They're already knocking against each other. The dominoes originally began in 1995 with the first Chinese dam. So China is the role model as well often as the beneficiary of hydropower development regionally. So you could build capacity in a targeted way, but you're basically dealing with nation states who lack capacity across the board. And unless you are very targeted in how you would go about beginning to answer your questions specifically in each country, in each sector, you will waste a lot of money very quickly with very little result. So until those countries have some kind of incentive, the leaders of those countries, to craft and play by a more rule-based system, it's going to be less technical solutions, less focused on what international NGOs consider to be their work in regard to building capacity, and it's going to be more explicitly political. That's one reason why I made the distinction between solutions demanding both technical and political solutions, and why technical solutions are looked upon as the way to go. Let's call building capacity in a given ministry or a given sector as a technical part of the solution. When the political factors are unmovable or beyond your control. But this is about the history of the evolution of nation states under a Westphalian system. Unfortunately, we're talking about countries that have other impacts that are decidedly non-Westphalian as they evolve. And it's hard for us to grapple with that when we're coming from such a capacity-rich society and system of governance. There's also the matter of linkages between sectors. Again, one of the key general frameworks I alluded to in my presentation, even within China, which has very high capacity, there are still very poor links between the Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the Ministry of Energy and the Ministry of Environmental Protection. There's very, very low capacity in China, a high capacity country by sector, to link those sectors together. It's one of the conundrums of working with Chinese politics. People don't talk with each other. And of course, we haven't done a very good job of that in the United States either. One of my first academic papers was cooperation or competition between the Forest Service and the Park Service around federal lands management. And we've gradually gotten better at that, but we started in terms of national parks, 120 years ago. And the Asian countries don't have that historical trajectory with which to work out these kind of capacity issues. So linking sectors within a country like Cambodia or a country like Laos, when capacity is lacking to do that in China, wealthier and more driven by data, is a serious problem. So when you're trying to create solutions, you need to be very, very targeted and look at the universe of what is possible instead of what you'd like to see. You need to kind of put on a Cambodian persona when you're going to work down there, keeping your American values and love of good governance, somewhere down in the heart.
Yeah, if I could just quickly, in our country and other, say, democratic countries, even then, even with democracy, most of our progressive legislation arises out of tragedies, out of catastrophes. Okay, so it's always that learning curve. But the difference for instance, in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia in particular, is that these single-party governments, without a rule of law, without an independent judiciary, it's all the harder, and that's why they have riots, and people rebel over situations that they can't control. China's a classic example of how many police cars have been turned over and burned in China. I mean, quite a number. I wish we had that market. Anyway, thanks.
One last way to kind of wrap this up and maybe generate another question is that whoever said, well, maybe you need to look at it in terms of state stability. The work that's ongoing that I was framing in my presentation is going to be working on the notion of, okay, how do these environmental and social impacts translate into undermining the stability of a state? If you can make an argument to a regime that it will become less stable if it continues to go down this particular path, then you've got some potential traction. You don't need rule of law. You don't need an independent judiciary. You just need to turn up the heat, start making the links between these sectors, create the timeline out a decade or two, and then see how the leaders might respond.
I mean, China has. I mean, I often jokingly call it, like environmental authoritarianism in China. Like sometimes they do their whole big energy efficiency push, but then so you see openings then, so for helping in China to make them understand the true cost and benefits. Just so you know, so modern here. Darren McGee up at Hobart William Smith College. You talk about him on a webcast, and so he'll email me. He texted me, said, "Open your email." I'm like, "Oh my God." He had a comment that the power output of dams are how much they're actually contributing to power availability within China. And he said the 7 Langsong dams will likely represent less than 5% of China's southern grid.
Yeah,
it's not a lot.
No,
it's not. Okay, and right side here, she's so patient. You stand up and tell us who you are and ask your question, and we'll go back to Darren. We'll give him a dribs and drabs
Newman,
out.
WWF, and going back to this slide and sort of building on some of the points you're making, if it's politics, it's about the bosses or whoever winning and feeling like they've won something. Right now it seems like the dam portfolio is developer driven, as you said.
Exactly.
And each dam is being proposed by a different company, different developers, and different EIAs, different EIA companies. It's kind of chaotic. But what I haven't heard from this today or previous work there is the alternative scenarios. Why wouldn't there be a community, especially with 2 banks up there who know the economics? Because it's about economic trade-offs, near term for the political leaders, near term for the developers, and long term for society. And those trade-offs, for example, fisheries and so on, are part of an economic solution. So why wouldn't there be a new version of where dams should go and what kinds of dams, diversion dams, so that we could be promoting something and not just criticizing? Has that been done?
It'd be nice to say promoting something and not just criticizing, but I mean the reality is that to me is that they're all individual. It's competition to get projects, and within the incentives within the projects may be very narrow. Like the developer wants to make a buck, or the bank and the developer are connected, and so they've got a deal going, and also that the developers get their money out early. And so if they're tripping over each other, whoever gets in first, is going to be okay. And so it's almost like the stock market. I mean, if you looked at the real economy and the value of these companies and their price earnings ratios, you'd have one outcome. But the point about stocks is that you're betting that you're going to get in there first. The market's going to go up, regardless of the reasons. You're betting it's going to go up, or you're betting it's going to go down. The point is that you're not looking at the fundamentals of this. You're not looking at from a total economic perspective. No government there does that, and so it's all fragmented in terms of how decision is being made. It's very, very narrow, very centered in a way. I mean, if you look at Nam Tuen Tu Dam is a classic, and here you have the ADB and the World Bank eventually got involved in helping to finance it and take care of some relocation and so-called mitigation. But you had the Tuen Hin Bun Dam already in that part of Laos, and they built Nam Tuen Tu, and they took half the water, diverted half the water that was going to Tuen Hin Bun, which is a different company. You know, Tuen Hin Bun was a French company, I think, primarily. And so then Tuen Hin Bun is building an expansion project to build another reservoir to take water from another river to replace the water that went to Nam Tuen Tu. Now, I was in the control room with a group after one of these MRC stakeholder meetings at Tuen Hin Bun, and so we say to the to the engineer, so how much power are you generating? And he said, we said, we're only generating half of our output. He said, in fact, the Thais pay a premium. EGAT pays a premium because they never take all the electricity they were committed to. So, all right, they're half output, and now they built Nam Tuen Tu, different developer, different financing. What the hell? I mean, hello, what is this about? You know, it's not about overall efficiency or even being economically viable overall. It's about this narrow pursuit of profit.
And that said, you know, our friends at International Rivers, they just put out their second, it's called The New Great Walls, A Guide to China's Overseas Dam Industry. I mean, this is just focusing on China. Yeah. And I bet being the little sneaky people there, they probably do it for other companies too. Yeah. But I mean, this is a comprehensive map. You go to their website, they give you Excel files that show you. But I mean, is this here's the question to you guys. Is this useful? I mean, this is putting transparency and kind of, you know, like you said, the craziness of the developer-driven domino dam thing going on there. Is this useful for international organizations, to going back to our TNC friends' question about what can we do, but how is this going to be useful? How is this?
Well, I think it goes back to partly to this capacity thing, building thing, and you know. The U.S. is involved in a minor way, but important way, in capacity building through this LMI and with these ministries that deal with power and hydropower and other power issues or water issues. And that is that psychologically, people who are in ministries who have technical responsibilities, they want to be recognized globally. They want to be recognized for their expertise. They want to increase their expertise. And at some point within the ministries, you get an evolution of where people with higher capacity are actually saying, hey, wait a minute, this is really stupid. And let me tell you why. And so I think that over time, it may be too late when it happens, but over time, I think there is a build-up capacity, and there's a psychological factor that isn't talked about often, but when you meet the people or you're involved in capacity building, you see they just can't wait to have it on their resume that they did this or that, or they had this recognition from abroad, and they're professionals. And so I think there's a possibility, but I don't think that people organizations that are promoting sustainable development can have it both ways. I mean, you still have to look at the trade-offs, and it's not where would the dam be placed to do the least damage. No, is the dam needed? What are the costs and benefits, and look at it that way.
Okay, some other questions. Right side of the room has fallen silent. Left side, back to you. It's like a ping pong match here.
Ben Weiner with Senator Sheldon Whitehouse's office. Along that same line, Dr. Cronin was talking about what the U.S. can do, apart from just capacity building, paying for some environmental studies. Is there anything else that the U.S. Congress or all the different nonprofits, organizations in the U.S. should be doing, apart from what they're already doing?
Well, that's a tough one, and if you just restricted to what the U.S. can do, definitely we could use a whole lot more money in, say, the Lower Mekong Initiative and related kinds of projects. You know, the reality is, like, we're not China. We don't do the kind of projects they do. We don't build white elephants or infrastructure projects anymore. What we're trying to do, and what we should be trying to do, is to help governments make better decisions. And that includes the capacity building, but also in terms of the Lower Mekong Initiative, it includes promoting regional interaction. So, for instance, the Mekong River Commission, bless them, and they're very important to this process, but at least in the Lower Mekong. But that's only the environment and water ministries, or water and environment ministries, represented in the MRC. Mm-hmm. And so any big decision has to go up to the prime ministers, really. I mean, that's what happened with Sayaburi. But in the Lower Mekong Initiative, all the countries that belong now have taken responsibility for working for pillars of study and hosting working groups, and it involves many ministries, or several ministries from each government that get together at the working level at these meetings, and then periodically it involves high-level summit, high-level meetings, including Secretary of State, or in some cases even leaders, national leaders. So those are all good things that we could be doing, and we could be doing more of. But I also think we could do a lot more at the ADB, for instance, and within the World Bank, to try to promote these alternative kinds of development models. It seems we still can't get away from the sort of Soviet or early Chinese style or current Chinese style infrastructure-led development.
Ed, do you have some comment on that?
Sure.
You could be the closing picture.
Well, there's direct and indirect ways to influence any political situation. I think because of overall political circumstances, the U.S. is best focused on less direct approaches. For example, instead of the U.S. working directly through the Lower Mekong Initiative, which I support, some of our energy might also go toward working with ADB, the Asian Development Bank, to get them to do the heavy lifting. That's an indirect approach, because the ADB has a better reputation in the region, and we don't. We bailed on Southeast Asia, and now we're coming back, but there's a cost to not being involved. Just like the Asian pivot also exacts a cost on how the regional partners we now wish to work with perceive our behavior. So I think less direct rather than more direct. In terms of what we might recommend to the ADB, for example, I'd like to see the low-hanging fruit tackled first. That would be opening up a cooperative data sharing around river flows in the dry season as well as the wet season, from the upstream and the downstream. There are other interesting ways to go. You could start looking at giving advice indirectly on doing studies of, let's call it, ecological infrastructure. What is the role of coastline ecosystem, salt marshes, in mitigating sea level rise? And how about targeting the way Asian cities are expanding along coastlines, and making sure that expansion was directed towards areas that could take more urban development, more concrete, rather than areas that might mitigate sea level rise because of their ecosystem service value. You could also take a look at migration issues, people moving internally within countries or between countries. People are going to move because of the cumulative impacts of hydropower development. So how do we manage that movement? Those are some of the different ways to look. And let me give you a few sources of recently published studies that build, like the International Rivers document that Jennifer was just showing us. Let's take a look. I've got a list here. Just today in Nature, there's an article on Indian Himalaya hydropower development that has a couple of ideas that might be useful in the Mekong. and it's just out this morning. And you can get it on the Nature website. You don't have to pay.
Are you one of the authors?
It's referring to a study that just came out that I am one of the authors on.
Yeah.
That there's two. One in conservation biology, which is also, I think, available on the website. Just Google conservation biology Indian dams, and you'll pull up the article. It just came out 2 weeks ago. Then in early January, Science will publish a piece on the Indian dam situation, again with some recommendations that could be more widely applied than just to India. And keep in mind, though, that we've been talking in the lower Mekong and the upper Mekong about authoritarian governments, one-party states, no rule of law. India has the same, if not worse, hydropower development issues in the largest democracy in the world. So we have to keep it open
Put
here.
that in quotation marks.
Yeah. So you can take a look at some of this new material on India and do some comparison between the Mekong and the Indian situations, but also some of the solutions would cover some of the same ground.
Could I add something to that also in response to your inquiry? There's something a little sneakier that I'd like to see the U.S. do, and maybe in conjunction with other interested countries. I think that we should be developing national technical means to do some things like assess the water levels of dams, to assess runoff flows, et cetera, that could then be shared with the governments. So we don't really need China to tell us anymore what's happening, whether they're filling or spilling their dams. There are ways to figure that out. And now, sometimes it's a little difficult when a dam is deep in a gorge kind of situation, but that's something I think we could be doing. And as I say, it's a little bit more on the sneaky side. The Chinese wouldn't like it, for one thing, but well, a lot of things they don't like these days. Okay.
I might agree, but I also might disagree a little bit with what you just said, Rich. I'll just leave that hanging, but I will go back to the technical versus political solution sets. I think that we don't need a whole lot of more technical study of these issues. Sure, there's some questions that remain unanswered, but sediment flow has been modeled by multiple international scientists and has all been published. But that doesn't mean the governments are going to pay attention to it. And so far, they haven't.
Well, the Vietnamese, though, are really upset about the sediment issues. And
they have the Mekong Delta.
Yeah, and the Cambodians to a lesser extent. And so I take your main thrust of your point. It's the political is the way to go, except that where information is not forthcoming, if it can be shared, then those countries have a stronger position to engage with China on a basis of knowledge, rather than trying to engage in Chinese saying, "Oh, don't worry about it. It's all going to be all work out for the better."
Because they've got the technical fix upstream.
Yeah.
So then the question becomes whether it's direct or indirect. How do you do these kinds of things? All good suggestions. Do you do it through an existing body? It could be the Mekong River Commission. It could be ASEAN. It could be the GMS, Asian Development Bank. It's probably better to try to piggyback, engage at something that's already existing rather than build something from the beginning. And so the trick in terms of targeting is to find which one of those groups would be most amenable to an addition to the conversation that might focus on bringing people together around these common issues.
Yeah.
But that has its own political minefield to negotiate. So, we're looking at a difficult international problem that is going to reduce the stability of every single one of the countries, including the upstream hegemon. They don't want to admit that yet, but I'm giving them 10 years max before the problems that resolve from any individual's country behavior starts to create non-negotiable social and ecological impacts. And that window is closing, and that window is an estimate. It could be 5 years. We have a little more time, but that depends on the rate of dam building in the lower Mekong and the upper Mekong. So we just don't know, but it's a dicey situation.
Okay, that's it. Now is it. You guys have given just incredibly thoughtful presentations and comments. Can we applaud for them one more time, please? And I'm feeling really good that just so you guys know, the China Environment Forum people may be a little uncomfortable because I'm talking Mekong, but again, it's linked with China, that I will be doing more work on this and bringing other smart rock stars and trying to come up with also, I really appreciated your last question about creative ways to engage with people in the region. And I think China will be key. So again, thank you so much. I do want to say thank my funders, Blue Moon Fund, Energy Foundation, Skoll Global Threats Fund, VLS, USAID, and let you guys know that on January 29th, we're going to hop back on the clean energy bandwagon for one meeting there, looking at China's innovation in renewable energy and opportunities for U.S. cooperation. But Mekong's coming back. Thank you so much, everyone, for coming. And they're within tackling range, so come get them. Thank you.